Welcome to Decrypt, Asia's first blockchain and cryptocurrency podcast. I'm your host, Tushar. Each week, we take a deep dive into the Asian blockchain scene with investors, technologists, and industry insiders. Go to decrypt.asia to subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Telegram to join in the discussions. Hi guys, today we'll be speaking to Alastair Johnson, who's the founder and CEO of Nuggets. Nuggets is a consumer blockchain product that helps users to log in, pay, and verify their identity using biometrics without the need for sharing their data and protecting their privacy. Our guest, Alastair, has spent over 25 years working as an entrepreneur and innovator, leading product development and product marketing for brands like Microsoft, Skype, Office, Xbox, HoloLens, Disney, TED, and the BBC. For those of you who've been actively listening to this podcast, you may remember Bancorus and Bluzell from episodes 3 and 9, both of which were accepted into JD.com's inaugural Beijing-based blockchain accelerator. Nuggets is also one of the other 6 startups that was accepted into the program. So you may be wondering why we keep talking to startups from the JD.com accelerator. The reason is that, unsurprisingly, JD has managed to choose very high-quality projects, and we at Decrypt Asia aim to speak to these high-quality projects, as well as other top entrepreneurs, investors, and thought leaders in the space of blockchain from around Asia. So let's jump into the interview. Welcome to the show, Alastair.
Thank you. Very good to be here. Thank you very much.
So I'm very excited to interview you because I see myself using the application that you're building. And I'll get into all of the nitty-gritties. But before we get into the details, I want to get to know your story. What's your background? How did you get introduced to blockchain? And what's the story behind Nuggets?
Yeah, sure. So we've been doing Nuggets a couple of years now, sort of officially, so to speak. Before that, I worked at Microsoft in terms of innovation with product and across to the consumers with those products. Sort of some special projects in amongst that in leadership roles, working with brands like Xbox, HoloLens, obviously Skype and Office in terms of that. So I spent a number of years there. And then before that, I had my own digital business. And then basically I've been in the digital space for about 25 years. Not want to show me age too much. And this very young entrepreneurs market these days. So I did that. And initially we was looking at cloud solutions and almost like Dropbox type solutions of, because it all came from the initial instance when I had my own card used fraudulently online. My details were taken from some location where I'd stored my personal information. I had to cancel it. And then when I came back and eventually got a new card 2 weeks later, and I realized I had to start plugging it back into like hundreds of different locations where I'd got my personal information and my payment information. I just thought, this is crazy. I'm trusting like 100 different businesses, all that they're looking after these in the best manner they are. And even when you do see these breaches, they're often the bigger companies that have got really good security and abilities in the first place. But I just found that there was so many breaches going on at the time, and it just dawned on me there had to be a better way. So we started looking at solutions, like I said, almost like a sort of Dropbox type solution of storing your personal information in a way that no one else could get to it. And then the key thing that we realized we needed was zero knowledge storage. Now, at the time, there was regulation in Switzerland where you could have servers that could effectively have regulation zero knowledge storage. And then there's workarounds on other cloud solutions, but all quite clunky and not necessarily global solutions. And then I started looking at blockchain more and more. And as I did, it was a bit of an epiphany. I was like a small child at the time. I got very excited that it was ticking both encryption, privacy, zero knowledge storage. It had the trust principles in there and the immutable ledger. So it really was something that ticked all the boxes for us. I mean, that was where it set off from. At that point, it accelerated very quickly, and we developed the concept out towards the blockchain principles. And that's really where it all came from and how we got going on it.
So I've lost my card a couple of times as well, after a couple of big nights out. And so I've faced what you faced in the past. So I appreciate what you're building. You mentioned a couple of technical things, which I'll get into as we progress through the interview. But before that, I just want to kind of understand you mentioned one of the problems, which is, you lose your card and then you have to update the card in like 100 different places where you've given your card details. But more broadly speaking, what are some of the other problems that you're solving with this project?
Well, what we realized was fundamentally out there at the moment, every business has a database of personal information of their consumers. And we're seeing that as those databases get bigger, and whether they're payment providers or whether they're retailers or banks or health or other scenarios like that, these silos of honeypot personal information, as we call them, get bigger and bigger. They become more valuable and therefore also vulnerable, because someone sees the value of all that collated information in one spot, all those credit card numbers, all those passwords, all those emails and other things that have a value out in the open market in both criminal terms and marketing terms where it can be abused and stuff. So we realised that the amount of breaches that were going on, and at the time it was really just getting into a pace like once a week a really big breach was going on from very big brands, and no one wanted it. The brand didn't want it, the individuals certainly didn't want it. And we realised very quickly that although there's this billion-dollar industry of protecting the existing model, it was a broken model, because it didn't matter how many millions that people were throwing at it, it was still getting breached. There was too many weak points. There's too many humans almost involved with it that were able to leave passwords around on Post-it notes and things like that. If you saw the famous one after the alert in Hawaii, they had their username and password on a Post-it note in the back of a photo, which was quite a classic. But, you get these very big brands saying that they've got 500 people looking after your security and privacy. But to my mind, that's 500 weak points, because each one of those often has a username and password and can access at root level into that information. And what we very quickly saw was this is a broken model and it needs to fundamentally change. Personal information should be kept by the person. And it's a common sense rule, really, instead of spreading it around the internet. And that's really where we worked from in terms of the zero knowledge. And the whole premise behind Nuggets is to not share that personal information if at all possible. And if a piece is required, the absolute minimum should be shared. But like I say, ideally over time, we see that it will be more a tokenized principle of information rather than actual clear text information being shared. So that's the key thing, what we're doing. Now, currently it materializes in what almost is a simple form of login, payment, and ID verification. But behind that is like a personal cloud where you're building up your components of your own information. You can move around and it's transitional and it can get more and more use over time. So that's really the essence of what we're doing. And the verified ID principle, again, comes from that personal experience when you get the fraud department from your bank. I had it actually yesterday. And they ring me up and then they say, can you prove, can you do your security information? Tell us your mother's maiden name, your first pet's name, and different characters from your password, and you keep doing it until they've almost used all of your password, but they won't prove it's them at any point, which is really scary when you're handing over so much personal information. So that was another component we realized that we had to prove out as well, is verifying your ID when you're on phone calls or in stores, or people visiting people's doors and saying they're the electric board or whatever. So those are the components that materialize off this solid foundation of identity and products and services. That's a key thing. It's not just identity, it's how it relates to payment and products and services.
So you mentioned kind of three aspects, login, payments, and identity. And you also mentioned, your application, into the e-commerce segment. Could you talk a little bit more about how this kind of plays in, perhaps walk through the customer journey? If I'm a user and if I want to start using Nuggets, where all will I be interacting with Nuggets in relation to login, payments, and identity?
Yeah, sure. So normally the way it works is you download Nuggets and you sign up with your biometrics. This creates a private key for access to your blocks on the blockchain. And then after that, you add a photo ID, and we correlate that photo ID with a selfie, which proves you're a human being moving around. So it's almost dual factor biometrics at that point. So it's proving that photo ID is good and the individual with this account has matched against that. And then we add a payment method and we correlate all these components to basically give us a cornerstone of trust, so that you can then start to do your first payment and the retailer can have a certain level of confidence that you are who you say you are and that your payment is good. So at that point, you can then log into a retailer site, or you can then pay for a product very easily. And every time you log in, and it needs additional verification for revisit, pings your app, and you have to use your biometrics to verify that to get in. And it's important that we have a manual step, and it's not just pure QR code, and that we do come back to biometrics for that extra security level as well. And then the same for payment. If you decide to check out with Nuggets, you verify with your biometrics. If you verify ID, you verify with your biometrics. So it's always certain that it's you who's on the other end of that. So that's the basic principle in terms of going into login. Now, the additional component we also have is when that product goes out for delivery, we can associate a token to go with that courier. And when they get to the door, they can actually ping you at the door, and you can verify on your app that you've received the package and that you're the right person to receive the package. Now, if you look at telcos and that, when they're sending out, $1,000 phones and such like, it's very important that you get them. There's a lot of business chargeback costs. In fact, it's 46% of chargeback fraud. Retail fraud is chargebacks. So it helps to prevent that. So very quickly, you can actually see that this is really an economic value for the business, and it's actually a business B2B play. In that, what we're doing is we're helping with fraud and identity of cards and people coming in who shouldn't be, and we're helping for chargebacks, and we're helping on false positives and preventing those. Because if you look as like the US market as an example, where it's quite bad, card and identity fraud is 16 billion in 2016. Now, false positives, which is when they risk assess your card and say you're not good today, but your card is actually good, is 118 billion. Now, that's 6 times the amount of actual card fraud. So retailers are losing an absolute fortune against risk assessment. And the key thing that we bring in with Nuggets is, as you do a transaction, we put a transparent flag on that transaction to say it was a good transaction, but we don't show what you spent and how much it was, because we have a privacy framework. Now, what this helps is that when you've built up, say, 100, 2,000 transactions on that digital identity, and you then go to do another retail transaction, you don't need to be risk assessed because you're being pre-approved in effect. It's using the trustless network principle to demonstrate that you're a good actor. And as you can see further down the line, you may not need to have credit references when you've got thousands and thousands of proofs of good actor on the network. And we also do this with the merchant as well. So they're proving that they're a real merchant and not a phishing site as well. And that's where the real value of the blockchain comes in, trustless network principle.
Right. So you just mentioned merchants. And so carrying forward the journey that we were talking about. So I get it from a customer's point of view. You use the Nuggets app to log in using your biometrics. You use it to make sure that the transaction goes through, that the payment goes through. And then once the courier comes, you can use the Nuggets app to verify your identity. From a merchant's point of view, how does it work? What are the steps involved if I'm a merchant and I want to start using your application?
Yeah, so we actually work with the merchants now. If you're an existing merchant on Magento or Shopify, that's something that we can work with their existing APIs to tie in the payment model and the login models and things like that. Now, some of the bigger players tend to be more bespoke, and we work with those in a bespoke manner. But effectively what's happening, you've got a consumer wallet on one end, you've got a merchant wallet on the other end, and also on the merchant side, the staff need individual wallets to access the merchant wallet. So what this also does is identify the staff that are accessing it, and also removes the need for username and passwords at the access point from the merchant as well. And then they've got a control panel in terms of where they can interact with the merchant wallet on there. So it makes it safe. And then on the third component, we've got an effective payment gateway wallet as well. Now we can work with existing payment gateways, or we can use our own. We can also use different token principles for payment. So we can have our own token. We can have existing EMV tokens, which are quite common nowadays, or proprietary tokens from certain payment gateways that we can use as well.
We've talked about the two stakeholders, the consumers as well as the merchants. And I want to talk about, how the what role the token plays. But before that, I had a quick question before we go to the token part. You mentioned the problem previously about having, hundreds of login passwords, and, you use multiple softwares and accounts, and you have these, multiple passwords that you have to remember. Will I be able to use Nuggets to log into multiple applications, softwares, and other accounts that I use?
Yeah, now there's some really interesting developments that's only happened over the last month, and one of those is Authing, and that principle from W3C actually works to the digital identity principle. So it's something that's going to be rolled out to a number of browsers soon as well, which very quickly enables a principle of digital identity like Nuggets to work with a lot of existing providers and roll that out. But also we can provide APIs and SDKs for people to work with us quite easily in terms of like a paragraph of code to access it. Now, obviously, we need those to be partners or to work with the Authing principle to be able to access that. And that's something, obviously, that we're working on. But we've had a lot of interest from a number of global banks. They tend to look at us in terms of consumers and their merchant services, and then the telcos, because they've got a lot of security issues. People are having their phones overtaken. You still got to log in. You still got to pay monthly, and there's a lot of customer service interaction as well that needs verifying. And then, of course, there's a retailer on that side where they tend to be quicker to move and have a good appreciation of the value of what we can bring to it. But yeah, in future, the real potential is that you can add your Nuggets account instead of your credit card to other services. That way, you can have all the breadth of that service, but you're not leaving your personal information in their honeypot silo. You're just using the tokenized representation from Nuggets in there. But when you come to pay, you can still access that token for payment. And if it's ever breached or abused on the other end, it'll have no use to anyone beyond the control of that specific requirement, and it can always be revoked as well.
So speaking of the token, could you explain the role of the token from both, the consumer's perspective and the merchant's perspective? How does the whole incentive mechanism work? And, who bears the cost, who benefits, and what your role is in the middle? Do you take sort of a cut in the middle, or how does the whole process work?
Yeah, sure. So when a consumer downloads the app, sets it up, logs in, maybe refers, does payment transactions or verifies ID, they actually get incentivized on the consumer side with tokens, which they can then use for products and services, which has great value in that. Now, on the economic cycle side of it, the merchant actually pays in token for services, and the value, the income model is actually we take a small transaction fee from the merchant side for payment transactions and other services, which are paid in tokens. And that is what gives it its cyclical value of the tokens. So it's quite a simple model in terms of what it is, but it's great for the consumer side, and it's also great for the merchant side in terms of being able to enable it.
Right, got it. So let's talk about this tech stuff a little bit. So you mentioned 3 key technologies in your white paper, which are central to your product. So you have the biometrics, which helps to capture the data. Then you encrypt this data, and then you kind of store it in a blockchain and store it in a private blockchain and use the public Ethereum blockchain to power the transactions. So high level, is that how it works?
Yeah, basically, what we do is, so you sign up, you get your private key associated to your biometrics, and then and this is the reason why everyone often asks us, why is it called nuggets? And when we was explaining to everyone about the blockchain principle in the early days, when a lot of people didn't understand it, we were saying it was like little nuggets of information. So we componentize all these individual bits of information, so we're only ever giving the minimum, if at all, we get providing information. So these are in nuggets in itself in terms of tokens and blocks within the blockchain. So we apply those into that, and currently we're actually we encrypt on the device first with our own encryption, and then we place it inside, obviously, the encryption of the blockchain. So it's dual encryption. Well, then we've also got a privacy framework on top, which because as we often see with cryptocurrency and blockchain, you can see a lot of the activity underneath, and so we've put the privacy framework on top of that so that people don't always want to reveal every detail. Now, at the moment, we're actually built it in an agnostic manner because it is a nascent technology, and these blockchains are coming out and evolving all the time, faster transaction per second, different value propositions, and we've always looked at that and looked at the potential of migrating over to better platforms if necessary. Currently, we're using Ethereum, and we run that on a private blockchain. And the reason for that at the moment is twofold. One, to do all the donkey work in the private realm and keep down the transaction costs, but also to get a faster transaction rate, 100 to 400 transactions per second in terms of that, whereas you're only getting 10 to 20 on the public.
Ethereum has, as our listeners may know, it's experiencing some scalability problems, and the time to finality is long, latency is high, and that affects you. And you're open to moving to a different protocol, a different platform?
Yeah, I mean, we are. It's not something that we necessarily want to do, we're trying to do, but obviously we need the transaction per second abilities in there, and also the cost of the network on the public, especially when you're doing smaller interactions, can be quite high. So it's something that we've always had in mind. And also, at the end of the day, blockchain is a nascent technology. And we are, I've said in the past that it's almost like I was at the early days of the internet, not the very early days, I can't say, but definitely when it was becoming more commercially viable for information sources and for brands and sites and stuff like that. And I remember it going from black text on white background and being very straightforward and starting to get more involved. And I think where we are now with blockchain is almost that stage. And the potential for the future is immense. And what is exciting is people as a whole will find the uses for new technology and evolve it in a way that we'd never have perceived. I mean, to think 20 odd years ago from the internet, and then we're now doing all our banking and services on the internet. And I think the same is going to happen, but I think it's going to be less years. It might be 10 years, it may be even 5 years before blockchains are a lot more immersed in everything we do. And I think we'll see it more, and it won't become the buzzword that it is now either. It'll be very commonplace, and you won't really even know that you're using blockchain. It's like you don't go around going, am I using Java today, or am I using other protocols? I think it'll be integrated, and that's what's exciting actually, is the problems it solves, the real people problems. Sometimes we all get too excited with the technology and try and find a use for it. But I definitely think it's all about the best solutions for people problems at the end of the day. And that's what we're aiming to do, really. And that's where we come from in terms of that. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves of it.
You mentioned that as far as storing the data is concerned, you use a private chain, and the nodes will be known to you and will store the data, and that data will be encrypted. But do you see any points of weakness or vulnerability there, even though the data is encrypted?
Yeah, well, we use dual encryption, and part of that is for the agnostic ability to be able to migrate in future. So we're in there. So we then obviously use the encryption of the blockchain, and then we've got the privacy framework. And with that, we've already it's almost like we've already seen potential weaknesses and then countered them with that principle. And also, it's keen that merchants and other parties on the network have their own nodes to keep it decentralized. We don't want to be the controller, and we see ourselves as an enabler, not a holder of the information. And that's a very important principle, because at no point does Nuggets have any access to any individual's information. And it wouldn't be right if it did, because we'd otherwise be effectively creating another centralized repository that we would introduce weak points from us having access to it. So, we're very much more about being an enabler, and also the potential for future migration, and maybe moving that identity across and working with other platforms as well.
Right, got it. You mentioned the use of certain interoperability projects like Polkadot, which I guess will make the transition between the private and the public chain smoother, as well as some scalability projects like Raiden, which you want to use at a later stage. Could you talk about how this would make the user experience more streamlined and quicker?
Yeah, well, I think there's some great products like Cosmos, Polkadot, Block Collider, and other services like that that are getting very close now. Probably not so much with Polkadot, although Parity have other bridging solutions. But yeah, I mean, the beauty of this is I don't think there's ever going to be one answer to whether that be blockchains, cryptocurrencies. I'm more of a believer as multiple solutions and maybe horses for courses and relevant. So having such things like Polkadot and Cosmos has great value in terms of being able to work and cross over to other blockchains and access the value propositions that come across of there. And yes, it may help to migrate in a whole, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to make it better for us all in terms of technology, and as we address different issues and regulations across the globe.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about your go-to-market strategy. You mentioned at a high level in your white paper in terms of how you're going to get the different stakeholders in the ecosystem to use Nuggets. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, what we actually find is a lot of people think, oh, you've got to go and introduce all the consumers first. But what we've actually find is we get cold called quite a lot in terms of some very big brands emailing us from our website, which is almost comical some days, and then asking us to continue talks with them and then starting relationships, because they see the value of it and how it can help their businesses. So we actually, what we found is, rather than us having to go out there and convince the consumers, the businesses are seeing the economic values and the proposition of Nuggets working with them. And then they want to then do pilots and push out the principle to their consumer base and actually drive it from the business out, so that they get all the benefits of reducing the fraud, false positives, chargebacks and things like that. And obviously not forgetting login details and easier principles of passwords. And a lot of the businesses, especially in Europe with GDPR, are really getting to a point where they want to keep as little personal information as possible. So that's actually driving the businesses towards product, towards Nuggets, and that's what's actually helping us and giving us a reach, because some of these brands have enormous user base, and although we may pilot it and come out to different sectors of the business initially, it gives a great potential to get a large user base of advocacy. And then after that, obviously consumers can see that it's a one-stop shop for login payment and verifying ID. And obviously we've got a long tail of other components that we can bring to play as well further down the line as we work on other things. So, and we're finding more and more from the community on a daily basis that people are coming up with ideas. And as I said before, it's something that I learned very much from Microsoft, if not before that, that the consumers will always use your product in a way but it's 10 times better than you as the business could envisage it. Because they're addressing real people problems that they've got themselves. And I'm a little bit selfish because where this is coming from is my initial problems with the internet and payment and cards and where my details have been and talking to my bank and talking to my telco. But there's, all the time that community, as it grows, they're coming up with ideas and scenarios and that. And that's what's great about this. I think that will definitely drive the product and develop it on the consumer side as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think especially the regulatory bit, I think governments around the world, and we've seen recently, with the Facebook questioning and Mark Zuckerberg's testimony as well, I think it's becoming more and more, privacy is getting more and more attention, and it's becoming more of a relevant issue. I want to talk about competition for a little bit. There are other self-sovereign identity projects out there as well, who you may not be competing with directly, but perhaps indirectly. Could you talk about the competition and what your value proposition is relative to these other projects?
Yeah, I mean, blockchain's always been seen as a good identity base, along with, asset ownership and proof and so on, and numerous different principles that blockchain's on that list of 9 key areas, so to speak. And identity is one of those, and there is a lot. Where we've come from is identity is a means to an end. And identity in itself is great and is useful, but unless you associate it with products and services, it's not as useful. So what we've basically gone for is very much an everyday audience on that thing that all of us do in an everyday scenario, be in e-commerce predominantly, or work or interacting with your telco or your bank and things like that. So some of us have got even grander visions of banking the unbanked, and this is also something, further down the line we think we can also work with and contribute. But there's some, a lot bigger visions and anonymity on social networks and things like that. But we've gone really to the man on the street, so to speak, the person on the street, I should say, so to speak, and looking at what their needs are on an everyday principle, because I think if you do get that everyday scenario, you'll get a better growth in terms of that, and also a more satisfied user base as well, because it isn't something that's used once a week. There's other identity and KYC products that might do for when you buy a big car or buy a house or do something, but we see this as what do I do most online? I'm logging in and then I'm buying stuff. Well, maybe that's just me, but it's certainly my wife as well. And so we went towards that sector, and that's how we've done it. It's the association. But I see a lot of value in the other ones, and I don't deride those other products. And it's horses for courses in terms of that. So I think we've all got value, and it's growing as a movement as a whole. But that's our niche in terms of everyday payment and e-commerce, really.
Yeah, for sure. So your company's not only been selected by the JD.com Accelerator, which is great, but also received the backing of 3 government bodies in the UK, the Department for International Trade, Greater London Authority, and the City of London Corporation. And you're kind of spearheading the whole UK-China tech mission as well. So it's kind of getting political also in a way.
I mean, it's great to get that support. Yeah,
absolutely. So could you talk about your experience and how you made all of this happen?
I think it wasn't. I wish it was. I've got the 4-point plan that says this is how you do it for the next business coming along, but it's not. It's not that easy and not that straightforward. It's through a lot of work to the point of not having many hours of sleep and never having any time to do anything, and struggling to find time to spend with my kids and stuff. But it's basically, I think it comes from a good idea is a good idea. And what really clicks with most people is an empathy. I've been to some very big banking conferences and talked, and we get asked to talk at a lot of them because they see us as blockchain stroke consumer approach and things like that. And I've talked to a lot of banks, and afterwards people have come up to me, and what is my favorite thing is they come up and say, I need this as a person first, and my business will benefit massively from that. And that's the biggest tick in the box for me, is that it's the person. We have an empathy with those people in that it's needed and as a service.
Absolutely. I see myself using Nuggets as well. So apart from these interesting developments, are there any more other developments that you would want to talk about, or give us like a high level roadmap of where you're headed in the next sort of 6 to 12 months? I know your public sale is about to go live on the 1st of May, and I don't know if the podcast is going to be live by then, but if you could just, give like a high level overview on what you're up to over the next, 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, well, we're always looking at opportunities, obviously, with different partners. We're still doing all the product build out. We're very close to getting out initial alpha as a MVP. It's important for us to say we are real and we're not just smoke and mirrors, but might turn up a year and a half away. So that's important for us to do that. We will have to continue ongoing developments, but hopefully the community will help us in driving those pointers and different principles. But also in, like you were saying, with working with the government, we've also been very lucky to get associated with a government body in India as well. But I think we're the only blockchain project that's on the India project. And so India we see as a massive market and is very exciting as well. So really in terms of the fundraising, it's something that we want to get done, get it out of the way and get back into full product mode. Working with partners, working with opportunities in different countries and regions like China, like India. We're getting a lot of pull towards Asia. It wasn't something that we initially planned. We went towards the UK, Europe, and then US, and then we got pulled towards Asia. So I guess it's growing those partnerships and opportunities in terms of that, and then really getting into doing product. I can't wait. I've got so many lists of features and components that I want to add to it. I just can't get it all out of my head at this stage, never mind about get it all built and tested and proven at the same time. So it just seems at the moment it's almost like there's so much stuff we can't see the wood for the trees, but hopefully once we get past the fundraising and we've done that, we can have a little bit more breathing space, grow the team, grow the partners, grow the opportunities and grow the product, and get it working in terms of bespoke formats for different platforms, and also commonplace platforms as well. And doing those details and those tweaks and seeing that opportunity of growing out that personal cloud of information for the individual.
Could you talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing with the body that you mentioned from the government of India? Because that sounds interesting. Yeah. Because I know the government of India has taken a pretty hard stance, like China, in terms of cryptocurrencies in general, but they're viewing the technology, the underlying technology, which is the blockchain technology, more favorably. So, I think I would be very keen to hear about what you're doing with this body from the government of India.
Yeah, indeed. And the reason why I didn't mention it directly is I can't remember the actual name of it. So right. I'm just going back to have a look at.
But what are you doing with them? What is it?
Well, basically, it's like almost like a regional accelerator in terms of they support us and help us come into India, work with existing regulation and things like that. I mean, in terms of what we've been doing with the FCA in doing a sandbox and testing environment, it's a similar principle, but probably not just with the FCA. It's more with the region of India, and they're seeing the opportunity. And like you say, with the crypto and stuff, it's almost like we need to get the funding out of the way so we can have easier conversations and that, because of the sensitivities around that. And obviously, we've got to be respectful and legal in those regions on that. But once we get back into the pure product and blockchain principles, we see that's something that can grow and bring benefit to those regions. And those markets are immense. China's such an amazing market in terms of opportunity. The fact that 80% of e-commerce transactions are done through mobile, if not more. The fact that everyone's so highly mobile adapted. And if you look at like China, they're going to have a 5G network that's going to be bespoke. No one else in the world is doing a bespoke network. They're just sticking it on the side of everything else. So the potential for that market is immense. Then you look at the India market, and it's like India's actually got more potential because it's growing and it's so fresh to a lot of these. There's a lot of great stuff going on already. And we've seen with the striking off of some of the paper currency recently, how it drove to mobile payments and the opportunities there. So the growth potential is probably even greater in India and very exciting as well. And it's something that I know Seema in particular, having come from India, Indian origins, she's very keen, obviously, to make a difference over there as well as in China. So yeah, it's a great opportunity to be working both with regulators, governments, and regions that are supporting in wanting to get into the technology and drive it forward for the benefit of their regions.
Yeah, that's very interesting times for you indeed. I come from India as well, so that's why I was very keen to get to know more about what you were doing. Before we wrap up, I want to get your outlook on the blockchain space in general. Relatively speaking, we're still in early stages, but do you see any trends, or what do you see happening over the next 12 to 24 months?
Yeah, I definitely see such things as sharding and so forth, obviously coming out, getting fruition, getting those transaction rates up, and maybe some more stability in terms of large protocol platforms, so that they're not so expensive and painful as the price goes up and down for them as well. But I think it's the adoption. I think earlier on the year, I was saying that this year I see as blockchain coming over to consumer side, and you may not even know as a consumer that you're using blockchain in the near future. In the past few years, it's been very much about large protocol infrastructure, big transaction rates for banks and stuff across the globe. This year, I think it's going to be more accessible to consumers, and it's going to be more omnipresent everywhere. And we're starting to see new opportunities, and we're starting to see them being realized and put in place and benefiting people. And when the person on the street starts to feel those benefits, I think it's just going to accelerate, and the potential and the technology. Because we're getting more time, it's had more time to develop, it'll get faster, better, more secure, more reliable, and getting around those problems that we've had in the past and just moving forward. And it won't be as such a media sensational piece, but it'll be good for us all as a whole.
Any last comments from your end? Anything that you would like to tell your community or the crypto community in general?
I'd say, we're all on this exciting wave, support each other, talk to us. It's funny, you do get some people in the community that seem to go out there and just want to troll. I can never understand why anyone's got the time or energy to go in there and give negative comments. But when you get those positive comments, and they are a higher proportion coming in, it's great, and we do appreciate people interacting with us and helping us with that. So please, I'd say, keep it up, and we're right at the start of some very exciting times for us all. So it's like, get involved with it, and let's all grow it out into the future so it benefits us all in the end.
All right. On that note, let's end the interview. Thank you, Alastair, for taking the time out to come speak with us.
Thank you. No problem. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Like us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Telegram, and subscribe to our newsletter on decrypt.asia. This is your host, Tushar. Thank you for listening.